Hello, it's Anthony Chadwick from the Webinar Vet, welcoming you to another VETchat podcast. And I'm super pleased to have Katie Mantell on the line. Katie is the CEO of RCVS Knowledge. I actually met Katie for the first time about 15 months ago at SPIBS in 2024, and she'd only just started in a role. We got chatting, and I was very keen to get her on the podcast. Sorry, I've taken a bit of time. You're busy as well, Katie, so it's really, really good to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's lovely to be here.
Katie, it'd be lovely. Obviously, you're now the CEO of RCVS Knowledge, but I know you've had a wide-ranging career also as part of the NHS, and it would be great just to hear a little bit about that as well before we start on some of the RCVS Knowledge topics that I'm very keen to cover.
Sure. Yeah, so actually, like a lot of your guests, I actually started out when I was very young wanting to be a vet. And I went along to some work experience when I was about 16 and decided that actually that clinical work wasn't really for me. And I ended up doing a degree in human sciences, kind of very broad based. And I remember thinking at the time, that's kind of weird. I was interested in animals, and now I'm doing this degree that's all about humans and people. I then moved into a career in communications, actually starting off in science journalism. So I started off in a small startup charity that was all about science and technology for international development. So I was an editor there for a few years, and then was really interested in the digital aspects of that role because it was kind of early 2000s, and it was quite
Yes.
radical that it was all online at the time because
Yeah.
online was a bit of a sideshow then, but I was really interested in the digital aspects, and that's when I moved to the King's Fund, which a healthcare think tank. Was there for many years in a number of different roles, leading on their initially digital communications and then broader communications in the kind of health policy and research space before moving on to an organisation that worked with the NHS. It was a health innovation partnership, so worked with universities and NHS organisations and industry to get research findings and innovation into practice in the NHS. So that's the kind of background I come from, as well as having quite an interest in how charities work and charity leadership. So I had a couple of trustee and non-exec roles at a hospital charity and also at the Mental Health Foundation. So I became really interested in how charities work and organisations work and are led, and all of that kind of then came together really beautifully from my perspective actually into this role in RCVS Knowledge. So I'm relatively new still to the veterinary sector, but have been really enjoying meeting people and getting to grips with a sector that is different but actually very similar in lots of ways to the healthcare
Yeah.
sector that I come from.
Obviously, it's mid-March 2025. People might be listening to this, in a few months' time. We've had the announcement within the UK of this abolition of the NHS England, which was quite a shock. And we can argue, how effective the NHS is. But I just wonder from a communications perspective, as an expert in that, it does seem to have been done in quite a heartless way, almost from my perspective. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think there is definitely something to be reflected on in the communications around it, certainly in terms of it being a massive kind of structural change. Thousands of people are employed by NHS England, and it being announced kind of quite suddenly and
Yeah.
unexpectedly. I think there's even something about the word abolished, which is
Yes.
quite kind of, I think, harsh for people who are working, doing good jobs that they care about. So I think I really feel for former colleagues who find themselves in a position of quite extended uncertainty
Mhm.
um, around their roles. And I think, I mean, I suppose one thing I would say is that, NHS England was set up a decade or so ago, intended as quite kind of a lithe and small organisation that would keep the NHS at kind of arm's length from meddling politicians. And really, over the years, it's become much, much bigger. And I think,
Yeah.
no one working in the NHS wants waste. And I think there are opportunities for efficiencies, and there are questions around whether all those structures are needed. But I suppose what I would say is, especially when something is communicated in that way and there's that extended uncertainty, I think the inevitable consequence of a massive restructuring is that it takes people's energies and attention away from delivering their work. So regardless of whether the structural change is the right one, and I think we do need to find efficiencies, I think there's something about the way it's handled which is proven, quite challenging.
It's been an area that I've kind of looked at. I read Harvard Business Review and so on, and comms, it's a really difficult thing to do well, isn't it? I run an event called the Veterinary Green Discussion Forum. We've done that for 3 years, running it again in the south of France in June for the first time out of the UK. And I thought I talked quite a lot about it. And then I put a survey out to the membership of the webinar vet. And I said, have you heard of the Veterinary Green Discussion Forum? And I got 6% said they did, which was a bit disappointing. Can obviously, as an expert in communications, what are maybe 3 tips that we should be doing to improve our communications? It's obviously something that's really important. As vets, as businesses, we have people in the consulting room. We often hear the story of the client goes out and says to the nurse or to the receptionist, right, can you tell me what these medicines are for? And what do I do with this, this, and this? And the vet may have spoken in the consulting room, but actually that message and that compliance message doesn't get through. It needs to, again, go through a third party, as it were.
I think simplicity of message is really important. I think it's really easy to overestimate the amount of time people will have to kind of process what you're saying to them. So I think being really simple and to the point is important. I think as well, people I know whose careers are around campaigning tell me that you have to keep saying things over and over again, and it's easy to overestimate the extent to which your message is landing with other people. Continue until you are sick of saying the same thing.
Yeah.
But also, and maybe slightly countering that, I think good communications is just always thinking about the audience and thinking and asking kind of why, what do you want people to do, think, or feel as a result of what you're communicating to them. So I do think thinking about your audiences and how they split down and what different things you might want to say to different people is really important. And you really know when you've succeeded, when it's not about you telling other people things. There's a two-way communication, and they are sharing your messages as well. So
well, and I would say, going back to RCVS Knowledge, the things that come to mind are obviously evidence-based medicine, quality improvement. These are the areas that you're very passionate about as a business. So that would be what I've learned from, my time interacting with people like Pam Mosedale, who obviously have been very involved in all the quality improvement things, and obviously reading, the documents that come out. And I know you brought a couple of areas that you really seem to be concentrating on this year, and that's obviously the first is the strategy document that you've created, Healthier Animals, People and Planet, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then obviously also the buzzword at the moment, and I don't know who started it, you perhaps know the history of this, contextualized care. Myself and Rachel Dean did another podcast where we definitely came into that whole area of contextualized care. So it's fascinating, but it's very popular within the veterinary profession at the moment, isn't it?
Yes, I've had a few good conversations with Rachel and myself about contextualized care, and I think it's one of those conversations, one of those areas where everyone has something to say. That's what I think is one of the things that's so interesting about it. People have emotion when they're talking about contextualized care, either because maybe they think it's so important and more needs to be done, or maybe because they feel irritated that maybe isn't this what being a vet is about? And I think both of those perspectives are kind of valid and interesting, and there's always lots to explore.
And I think it's so good, and we'll talk about the summit in a bit. We'll talk about the report first, but it's so important again within that communication, and certainly with our own event, the Veterinary Green Discussion Forum, it's about sitting down. And sometimes I think the world's becoming very binary. I am right, you're wrong. Whereas actually, I think it was Stephen Covey said, seek first to understand, then to be understood. So
Yeah.
if we're able to perhaps listen more than we speak and see where different people are coming from, I think we end up with a much more nuanced and, if you like, a grayer appreciation of areas. Because I find, as I'm in my later 50s, the world isn't really black and white. A lot of it is grey. And so listening to people who perhaps you don't agree with, it is challenging because we just want to sometimes shout people down, but actually learning from why people are doing a certain thing that we don't agree with, I think gives us greater understanding, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think so, particularly around contextualized care, I think you're right, it's a bit of a buzzword, isn't it? It's been around for
Yeah.
a, a few years, I think since 2021, but it's really come to the fore in the last year. I expect
Yeah.
CMA investigation has something to do with that, as well as a number of different factors. But it really feels like the time is right to have a conversation of bringing together many different perspectives about, do we understand what contextualized care is? What does
Mm,
good contextualized care look like? What are some of the barriers and enablers to delivering it, and how can we support it to be delivered in a really widespread way that leads to
mm,
good, animal health outcomes and welfare outcomes. So we've started a piece of work earlier this year where we brought together people from across the veterinary sector, together with some pet owners, representatives from pet insurers, and a whole range of people from across the sector to start kind of having these conversations around what does
mm,
good look like, and what are the things that kind of maybe get in the way of delivering contextualized care? What are the things that enable it to be delivered well? And so that was a real kind of starting point for this initiative that we'll be carrying out this year, which is about to move into a research phase. So we're working with an independent research partner who will then be doing some surveys and interviews and focus groups with members of the veterinary team and with pet owners to kind of draw together more evidence about
mm,
these issues, with the aim of, in the summer, we'll be bringing people together again into a summit where we'll hear some of those research findings, and we'll be trying to seek input from lots of different people with different perspectives to lay out what a roadmap might be for the implementation of contextualized
mm,
care. And I think it's interesting because it's something that some people do very, very well. So what makes that easy? What's getting in the way, and what tools or support could be put in place to make this easier?
mm,
So whether it's we need to look at veterinary education or other things about preparing pet owners for veterinary consultations and thinking about the questions that they need to ask, or are they
mm,
decision making tools or communication skills training?
mm,
All of these things I think are things that people talk about that are potential solutions. But I think there's something about this moment in time bringing people together to
mm.
really think, well, what are the priorities, what needs to happen, and who is best placed to take this forward across the sector? So that's one of the things that we're looking to do in this first year of our new strategy that we're laying out actually
Yeah.
this week.
I loved, and I can't even remember who kind of taught me it, but it very much became part of my practice, which was very much around, that triangle of relationships between the vet, the client, and the animal. And I think if one of those people is missing, calling the pet an animal, a person, because I usually say we've got to make the right decision, for the pet, because as a vet, obviously we're their advocate, but it has to work. Because if we make the client feel guilty about stuff and they go away and they're not compliant, then that also doesn't help. Also, I think there is an element of you need the time to do that, to communicate well,
Yeah.
using written documents at the end, because people can forget what's being spoken about in the consulting room. Whereas if it's recorded in some way within the consulting room, and I'm loving the idea of some of the AI tools that are coming out that actually record what's said in the consulting room and then can précis them and get them sent out to the clients, because it is very easy. People do get scared by a white or a green coat, don't they, as well? So having those extra tools to help with communications are really important. And then, as we've said, although it's a triangle, more and more now also bringing in that environmental element as well of saying, well, how does this treatment actually affect the environment, be it a spot on bleed preparation, or there were medicines that I was uncomfortable using because even 20 years ago I knew that they were quite damaging potentially to the environment as well. So I would avoid those pretty much without fail. So it sounds really interesting. It sounds like you've got some surveys. If you feel that it would help, please do give us
Yes,
some
that'd be
links and we
great.
can put them below the podcast, and hopefully we'll get some replies. The more people who reply, the richer the response, the better the outcome will be for the profession as well, won't it?
Absolutely. And picking up on your point about environmental factors, I mean, absolutely. I think sometimes in some conversations, sometimes I think contextualized care can be presented, can't it, as if it's all about cost. And of course, that
Yeah,
is a really important and very topical factor at the moment. But the way we see it as being, much broader than that, isn't it? It's
yes,
around, there's a lovely diagram my colleague Sally Everett has around some concentric circles
yes,
around the animal, the owner, and the kind of vet in the center, and then there's the whole
yeah,
context of the animal owner's
yeah,
values and
yeah,
financial situations, and then what's available in the practice, and right.
yes,
And then at the kind of outer circle there's sustainability, which of course includes financial sustainability because
yeah,
businesses need to continue to operate, but also environmental sustainability. And I think that's really interesting, isn't it? So thinking about potentially, I don't know, a question for the veterinary profession, I suppose, thinking about prescribing an antiparasiticide to the animal in front of you, the extent to which you also think about the other animals, maybe not in your immediate care, but the wider environmental consequences,
yeah,
whether it's songbirds or fauna in our rivers, etc.
yeah,
So it is really complex, and I think it's interesting because our world increasingly does want to make things black and white, but I think
yes,
it's the art, isn't it, of veterinary
yes,
practice is not black and white, and it's
yeah.
complex. I think,
There's a
yeah,
scientific element, but there's definitely an artistic
yeah,
element, I think, to being a vet as well, and learning to deal with those uncertainties of life. If you are certain about everything, you're invariably, getting it wrong, because as you learn more and more about a topic, you realize almost how little you know, and then you have to rely on other opinions and obviously looking for evidence, etc. It makes the job more exciting because if you have all the answers to everything, it must get boring. That's my theory anyway.
yeah. And I suppose that's what professional judgment is, isn't it? It's
Yes.
balancing up the risks, awareness of what you don't know, but sometimes needing to make your best professional decision.
Yeah. It's interesting. Obviously, going now on to the report, Healthier Animals, People and Planet, the RCVS Knowledge Strategy for 25 to 29.
Mhm.
Um, I obviously spent some time looking through it. I'm interested. Obviously, I see the animals and the people part. I know you talk a bit about antibiotic stewardship. The planetary thing, I think as a profession, I would love to see the profession leading the way for other professions, other industries. And I think there's certainly some fabulous organizations out there doing some really great work, fabulous individuals doing great work. But I still see those as early adopters. I don't see a widespread recognition that we should have some sort of custodianship around the environment. We have a lot to offer in the position that we have with an understanding of the environment, particularly farm vets, also the animals as well. And seeing that link, healthier animals, people just gain so much. We've got a little cat who adopted us there. I think he's just around the corner having a sleep. If he comes and jumps on me, don't be surprised. We then turn it from, it's not a podcast anymore, it becomes a podcat. And Buddy does get involved, but he's having a snooze by the radiator at the moment. So we may not see him over. But obviously, animals bring so much joy to people's lives, don't they? And the environment also does that. And I'd love to see us embracing that more. So it's interesting that you put planet in there. Do you kind of think that we're further along the line than I've said, or would you kind of agree with the inference that we're still in the early stages of adopting sustainability, given your experience, for example, with the NHS?
Yeah, I think I would agree with you that there are some great examples and great individual and some organisational efforts, but I think certainly having come from an NHS and healthcare context, I feel we've got some catching up to do there. I
Yeah,
mean, NHS was quite bold and ahead of the curve in setting itself some quite ambitious targets
yeah,
around its carbon emissions. And you can already we could see that kind of rippling out across the sector. So, for example, in my last role, because we weren't part of the NHS, but we worked with the NHS, we were looking at so that we could be on the procurement protocols, and because it's the right thing to do, our own carbon footprinting. So I went through that process for the organisation.
yeah,
Actually, learned it was fascinating and quite detailed
yeah,
to do that. But that's the kind of thing that I think we all have a responsibility to be looking at our own organisational impact and also what we can do to influence some of those bigger issues. So the addition of planet in our kind of organisational vision. So RCVS Knowledge, we're a charity, we're the charity partner of RCVS, and as part of this strategy process, we actually changed some of our vision wording, and it's very deliberate to include planet in there. And I think this is kind of indicating that we want to do more in this space over the next
mm,
5 years. I'd love to come back in a couple of years' time and you can
yeah,
hold me to account to that word. So I think you're right, we've already are quite active in terms of responsible antimicrobial stewardship, both in small animal and equine, in terms of some of our online learning that we provide and looking at audit tools, as well as in the farm sector, particularly with our farm vet champions, community of
yeah,
learners, and we're doing some quite interesting work in the ruminant sector at the moment, looking at data collection and responsible antimicrobial stewardship. But I do think our work in the next 5 years needs to go beyond that. So I think there's some really interesting intersections between sustainability and quality improvement, which, as you said, is something we've really championed over recent years. So this kind of idea of kind of SUS-QI and using quality improvement tools to improve environmental sustainability and other forms of sustainability. And there are already some great examples of it. So one of our Knowledge Award winners last year were Yorkshire Vets. It was a lovely kind of nurse-led programme that involved audit, that involved reducing their use of oxygen and volatile anaesthetic
yeah,
gases. I think there's a lovely stat. I think it was they reduced their carbon emissions, which was equivalent to kind of driving from London to Rome and back through that
yeah,
audit. So there's that kind of work that I think we can do more. I'd like us to do more to support, and also kind of going back to contextualized care and that kind of outer ring of contextualized care being around thinking about the environmental and taking some
yeah,
responsibility for the environmental impact of those individual decisions that are kind of made at a consultation or a practice level. So without our planet, there's nothing, is there? So I think
yeah.
we need to take
You
it
can't run a
seriously.
veterinary practice if there's no planet, can you?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, with Yorkshire Vets, my ideology, my thoughts is always do something. And so that sort of, to Rome and back, in terms of all of the miles that are driven on the planet, it's a small amount. But do you know what? It's a start. It's something that we should be doing. And when we do that, then the next year we say, well, why don't we get to Africa? So it's building on those successes as people become more enthused. And I think it's a really holistic approach to bring the three elements in together because, of course, they are all interrelated. If we have a beautiful planet, we know that when we put people into conservation areas to volunteer, that has a huge social prescribing benefit. I know Lancashire Wildlife Trust is one of the organisations we work with, and they've had people going into these environments coming off, antidepressants. £1 of cost brings £7 of value. Again, if we can look at the NHS as the national health,
Hmm.
service, it's looking after keeping people well rather than helping get them better when they've been sick. I
Mm.
think then we have a much more holistic view and probably will save many, many pounds doing it that way. Perhaps to finish, I was quite surprised reading the report that RCVS Knowledge has been around since 1958. It's older than me. And of course, part of its remit is very much to celebrate veterinary history. And I know that's been very much part of the report as well. So, yeah, tell us a little bit maybe about the history. What are you doing? What are you sort of collating to keep that history in our mind, so to speak?
Yes. So I think this is a really lovely part of our work. What I really notice is everyone's eyes kind of light up when we talk about just the history of the veterinary profession and also wider animal health. So we're the custodian of the RCVS archives and really excited actually to be moving into the new RCVS building later this year, where we'll be able to have some of these items available for people to see. So they include things like all of the I'm going like this. I don't know if you can see my hands. These amazing
Yeah,
big books where veterinary, so all of the signatures are there. That
yeah,
everyone when they became a veterinary surgeon. We
yeah.
have a wonderful historical book collection and some lovely, some really still unexplored. Actually, I think that's what's so exciting, that we've got still unexplored archives of historical, letters that have been sent. My
Yeah.
colleague was telling me about a letter that was around some of the vets that were on the Titanic when it sunk, and that's one
Wow.
area that we want to do a bit more exploration and document that archive. And we've actually just relaunched our veterinary history website. I can give you the link of that as
Yeah.
well, which is, oh my goodness, you've got an afternoon, you want to look through that, you will,
Yes.
it's fantastic. You can really explore digitally the letters, some of the fascinating kind of artwork that's been done. So we're really excited to now kind of have a digital platform where we can share some of
Yeah.
the archive materials, and to also to be able to later on this year invite people into the physical space to see them. It's a lovely horse's model of a horse's hoof from the 1820-ish, I believe, that was a training model that you can kind of take apart and things, and all these
Wow.
lovely historical artifacts. So we're looking
And from
forward.
1820 as well, we think of those sort of models as being very modern, but again, it will be fascinating to see some of these things.
Yes, so we're really looking, it's always with these things, it's around the human stories that come out of them.
Mm.
So we have a archivist in our team who will kind of be working to kind of pull out these stories and share them,
Yeah.
on social media, inviting people in to come and see them. So that's a really exciting part of our work over the next few years.
So lots of interesting things going on with the summit in the summer.
Mhm.
Obviously, the report. I think it's interesting, particularly on the environmental thing again, that there are so many reports out there, but we need to take action. So
Mhm.
action speaks louder than words and words on paper or spoken. But I'm really fascinated. The antibiotic stewardship is actually massive because, there are people dying at the moment and animals because of resistant bugs. So, I just encourage to carry on that work, and it would be great to hear even more of it and how we as veterinary surgeons again should be very much part of the solution to that problem. Because I think again, there is a tendency if we're not careful that we get blamed for it. So we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to reduce the use of antibiotics by more use of vaccines and so on and so forth, and obviously better husbandry. So thanks so much for sharing that. I've certainly had a skim through it. I will look at it in more detail as I know it's coming out this week as well. So
Mhm.
for those of you listening again in the future, we're talking about, the middle to the end of March when this document comes out, and it's really showing the strategy that RCVS Knowledge will be following till 2029. So lots of interesting things for you to keep yourself busy with over the next 4 or 5 years, Katie.
Yes, there's certainly a lot to do. And I suppose one of my reflections as leading not a massive charity is that our impact is really through collaborating with others. It's through being able to share the great stories and successes of others. It's through working in partnership, especially when we're working on some of these really big issues like some of those environmental sustainability and looking at changes in the way that the profession works. So it's really the key to our impact and our success is all around collaboration and how we can work with others. So looking forward to doing that over the next few years.
Yeah, and I've really enjoyed doing this webinar as this podcast, should I say. So I hope that people will enjoy listening to it as much as I've enjoyed speaking to you today, Katie.
Great. Thank you so much for having me on, Anthony. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Katie. And thanks everyone for listening. Hopefully see you on a podcast or a webinar very soon. Take care and have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.